issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And later this week, on Thursday and Friday, we hold our third Student Success Symposium, and our theme is Advancing Equity and Inclusion in Our Community. And this is open to everyone in our community. Karen just put the link in the chat there. And it includes sessions on academic ableism in higher education, the importance of inclusion of our neurodiverse students, and increasing equity with universal design learning principles, all of which Dr. Dolmage will address in his talk. So before I get to his introduction, I just want to say this, part of this Messy Conversations is an interactive dialogue, but just a quick reminder to everyone that this is really to focus on the critically important issue of ableism, academic ableism, and to respect everyone, we don't want to talk about, this isn't necessarily about individual situations or personal questions or identifying any particular faculty member or student or anything like that. But if anybody has any specific concerns or questions, they can email their campus DSS director or Karen Christ, who's on here helping moderate the conversation. So without any further ado, Dr. Jay Dolmage, our guest speaker, is committed to disability rights in his scholarship, service, and teaching. His work brings together rhetoric, writing, disability studies, and critical pedagogy. His first book, entitled Disability Rhetoric, was published with Syracuse University Press in 2014. Academic Ableism, Disability, and Higher Education was published with Michigan University Press in 2017. Disabled Upon Arrival, Eugenics, Immigration, and the Construction of Race and Disability was published in 2018 with Ohio State University Press. He is the founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. Among the various awards and fellowships he's received, he was awarded Outstanding Faculty Performance from the University of Waterloo, where he currently serves as professor and associate chair in the Department of English Language and Literature. It's really a great honor to introduce Dr. Jay Dolmage.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So I'm going to jump right into it because I think that's part of the character of a messy conversation, is to jump right in. And to do so, I'm going to suggest that higher education is a space where we encounter ableism, right? It's an ableist space. And higher education employs logics of both ableism and disableism. And I think I want to define those two concepts and those kind of logics because I think they help us understand how higher education works. So disableism can be defined as, quote, a set of assumptions, conscious or unconscious, and practices that promote the unequal or differential treatment of people because of disabilities. In short, disableism negatively constructs disability, right? It says that the values and material, it impacts and negatively constructs the values around disability, but also the material circumstances for disabled people. Ableism, on the other hand, instead of necessarily situating disability as bad and focusing on that stigma, positively values able-bodiedness. In fact, it makes it seem compulsory, right? It makes able-bodiedness and able-mindedness compulsory. So disableism is a kind of logic that constructs disability as negative, and ableism, on the other hand, renders disability as a kind of invisible, disposable, or undesirable thing, while able-bodiedness is represented as ideal, normal, and the mean or default. In a lot of my work, I focus on the term ableism, not because disableism isn't present in academia or in higher education. It absolutely is. And disableism can never be fully disconnected from ableism. But academia really powerfully mandates able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, as well as other forms of social and communicative hyperability. And that demand can be best defined by ableism. In fact, I think few cultural institutions do a better or more comprehensive job of promoting ableism. What we also learned from higher education is that disableism is almost always wrapped into and sometimes hidden within ableism. To value ability through something like the demand to overcome disability, or through research to cure disability, there's also an implicit belief that being disabled is to be avoided at all costs. This belief then leads to structures in which disabled people live in poverty, are underemployed, and so on. In higher education, it means disabled people simply don't make it. And then their life options and choices shrink considerably. As activist and scholar Lydia Brown writes, quote, "Ableism is not some arbitrary list of bad words. It's violence. And unfortunately, ableism is really the way we have always done things in higher education. So it's been very, very difficult to change." To put this idea of ableism into a physical context, I use the metaphor of the steep steps. So that's the first. I'm going to give you 3 images today, 3 metaphors. The first is of the steep steps, right? College and university campuses are full of steep staircases, and steps have been part of the lore of higher education for decades. Unsurprisingly, when Disney and Pixar animators wanted to create a realistically forbidding setting for the film Monsters University, they studied Ivy League campuses and Research One universities. So the MU School of Scaring has broad, high marble stairs, just like those you'd find at Harvard or Stanford. I'm going to show an image of this right now. Give me half a second.
Jay, I cannot see your slides.
Yeah, I'm just going to share it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so in this image, we see the MU School of Scaring, and it is this kind of neo-Gothic building. There's a set of about 15 stairs that lead up to an archway, several ionic columns in the front of this building, a big dome behind it. It's kind of like a Franken building of all of the different types of Gothic and neoclassical architecture that we might see on different campuses. Interestingly, also in the film, you know, we have this highly traditional setting, this backdrop, right? But the bodies that have to move across this space couldn't be more diverse. They're monsters, literally, right? And so it's no surprise then that the film is actually about dropping out of university. It's actually about the cost of being a body that is unfit or misfit for these traditional spaces. And that's where the drama of the movie comes from. And unfortunately, sometimes a lot of the comedy from the movie as well. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that now. You know, on my own campus, it's a brutalist architecture across my campus. So it's big, giant concrete staircases everywhere, right? And so I think we all, whether during our undergraduate degree or the campus we work on now or campuses we've been on, we can develop some associations with these steps and staircases, right? As David Orr wrote in an article on architecture as pedagogy, quote, "The curriculum embedded in any building instructs as fully and as powerfully as any course taught in it." So I use this as a metaphor as well, right? Because the steep steps puts forward this idea that access to education is a movement upwards, and only the truly fit survive the climb. Higher education is a place for the very able. Not only have people with disabilities been traditionally seen only as objects of study in higher education rather than as teachers or students. Not only has disability been a rhetorically produced stigma which could be applied to other marginalized groups, right, to insinuate their inferiority or deficiency and to keep them out of higher education, but the university is seen as performing a cultural function, a societal function of pulling some people slowly up the stairs and arranging others at the bottom of these stairs. So one of the questions I have for you today is to just think about how that steep steps mentality has shaped your own education. Who and what helped you up the stairs? Where were they steepest? What pushed you back? Where did you start on the stairs based on your own privilege or lack of privilege? The truth is that higher education does sort our population by a medicalized and legalistic definition of ability, and it does so really efficiently. Universities continue to function to keep certain groups of individuals out of the workforce, away from knowledge and dialogue and power, even as they provide pathways for others, right? Only 13% of US citizens 25 or older with a disability have a bachelor's degree. And that compares to 31% for those without disabilities. Nearly 2/3 of disabled students are unable to complete a degree within 6 years. just 41% of students with learning disabilities complete their post-secondary education. And disabled students are likely to have up to 60% more student debt by the time they do finish their education. The statistics are also skewed because they only account for the students who seek help. And some studies show that 2/3 of disabled university students don't receive accommodations simply because their colleges don't know about their disabilities. We have a generation of students right now, the National College Health Assessment tells us, who are more likely to experience education as disabling. That's the first major trend. And the second major trend is that they're much less likely to seek help than previous generations of students. And that's a pretty tough combination, right? So I'll give you another statistic. In the United States, 94% of students, of learning disabled high school students get assistance, right? Only 17% of those students get assistance in university. That's shocking, right? The very thing that helps students succeed in high school and graduate and get into a program, they're not going to seek that same help at the university. And I think the steep steps metaphor is a powerful one to hold on to and think about, because there's something telling students that they shouldn't ask for help. There's something telling students they need to do it on their own. They need to work harder, right? They need to overcome their disabilities, or that they should be ashamed to admit that they need help. There's a cultural shift in higher education that I think can really harm a lot of students, right? We also know, of course, that in a world in which the presence of overt and systemic racism needs to be foregrounded in all that we do, those steep steps disproportionately impact, for example, Black students. Right? There have been specific incidents, but there are also systemic issues, and these often intersect with disability issues. We know, for example, that African-American males are disproportionately placed into categories of special education that are associated with extremely poor outcomes at the K-12 level. Right? It's been called the school-to-prison pipeline. Yet education researcher Joy Banks has shown that African-American students with disabilities experience difficulty accessing disability support services and appropriate accommodations at colleges and universities. So for the same group of students, a disability diagnosis at the K-12 level can be hastily applied and will lead to negative outcomes, right? So we have to understand then that on campus, they've dealt with a different interface with disability, with a different set of stigmas around disability. And so the help is going to have to look different. The assistance is going to have to look different in post-secondary education. And I think we have to understand that this applies to our colleagues and to graduate students, right? We often don't even try to imagine the ableism experienced by faculty, instructors, staff, graduate students. And the result then is a culture of silence and passing. We're losing a lot of disabled students. We're losing a lot of disabled teachers and researchers. And these steep steps, I think, is one way to think about this. All right. So that's my first metaphor. And I want you to think about that. And I hope we can come back to it when we have time for discussion. The second thing I want to talk about is a retrofit, right? Because we've seen in kind of what we might call neoliberal spaces, spaces where we can talk about the value of equality or equity or diversity, but many times the actual structural and systemic responses put disabled students, for example, in difficult places. And I use the retrofit as a way to explore our temporary and sometimes kind of unsatisfactory responses to disability in higher education. So a retrofit, we think of retrofitting with cars or factories, right? We add a component or accessory to something that's already been built. This doesn't make the product function, but it kind of acts as a correction. It adds a modernized part in place of an older part. It allows a product to measure up to new regulations. Automobiles or factories are retrofitted with new parts so that they can pass new guidelines, right? And in terms of accommodation of disability, then, a building might be retrofitted by adding a ramp onto the side of the building or around the back instead of at the main entrance. The law calls for reasonable accommodation. Common reason then seems to dictate that disability is supplemental to society, an afterthought or an imposition. Students have a right to retrofitted accommodations in our classes, but I'm here today to say that that's not enough. In the history of disability in higher education, a rights-based approach has often meant that disabled students are invited in the door, they're counted and added to diversity statistics, but then the culture of the university makes no changes, no lasting adjustments to account for their presence, participation, and thriving. I'm going to show another image here, and this is of a tweet that was posted by a student at Hull University in the UK. This student's name is Sarah Marie De Silva. She posted this picture on Twitter showing how she is forced to take in her zoology lectures on campus. When she arrives at the lecture, there's only one place for her to sit, in the doorway at the back of the room. That doorway has a push button entrance and an automatic door, so it's an accessible doorway, right? It allows her to get into the room. But when she gets in, there's nowhere to go. In fact, she has to sit in the space that all of the other students need to move through to get into this amphitheater style classroom. And this kind of classroom might be familiar to some people. It assumes that there would be no students with disabilities in the room, let alone at the front of the room as a lecturer. As you come into the room, you need to go down a set of stairs to access the tables, which are kind of, is there a question there? Nope, sorry, all right, I'll keep going. There's a set of stairs that lead down to these tables where students are seated. We can see students in this image. If you go down 3 sets of stairs, you access the table, students fill those tables, right, and move on down through the classroom. Students are seated at the tables right in the image with their laptops, with drinks, and Sarah is stuck at the back of the room. We'd have to assume that in fact, Sarah Marie has to wait for every other student to enter the room before she can enter the room, right? And if there was more than one student with a physical disability, there wouldn't be space, right? Also, anybody else who needs to come into the room after the lecture is started would hit that button on that door, the door would open and it would hit Sarah Marie. Okay, so it's a bit of an extreme example, but I think it captures this metaphor of the retrofit really powerfully, right? When she gets in, there's nowhere to go, right? Disabled students may be there in our classrooms, they may be able to get into the room, but their participation is already minimized. Okay, so, you know, and in a way, the ways that we create access, not just in the physical classroom, but on the syllabus and within the curriculum, when we do these in minimal ways, we can actually further stigmatize students. Many times, retrofits are rhetorically and concretely constructed in ways that might even enhance exclusion. To begin with, there are a really limited range of accommodations offered. More than 3/4 of the accommodations offered are the exact same thing, extended time on tests and exams. And you know, you may not offer tests or exams and maybe never in a timed way. But if that's the case, and we keep working with disability services who are forced to work with such a narrow range because that's, you know, that's the majority of the accommodations that they need to give, then that ramp actually leads students nowhere, right? We need a much broader repertoire of accommodations. In classrooms where we rarely give tests and we rarely lecture, we have to work to expand the range of accommodations that can be offered to students. We argue for innovative teaching methods that move beyond lecturing, testing, and rote learning, but continuing to work with this narrow range of accommodations can ensure that they stay in this old kind of Fordist educational regime where timing reigns supreme. And I think instead we should consider every temporary one-time accommodation as an argument for permanent change. All right, and here we get an opportunity to kind of move into the present because things have changed in higher education over the last couple of years, right? In our forced pivot online, I know a lot of you are already teaching online, but during the pandemic for many educators, they were teaching online for the first time ever, right? And many of them learned how to do things like caption video, or how to provide transcripts for lectures, or how to share those things so that students could access them at any time. Really interestingly, those were the things that disabled students were asking for decades, right? And we're told that they were impossible. So for example, the largest study that was ever done of disabled undergraduate students, this was done at the University of Illinois, 303 students responded from 49 different courses. And here's what they were asking for. And this was prior to the pandemic. What they really wanted were recorded lectures as videos, transcripts for lectures and for those videos, as well as course textbook, book, and instructor notes and slides that they could engage with offline. And those are all things we began to offer really quite broadly during COVID. In April 2020, studies surveyed 826 faculty members and administrators at 641 American colleges and universities, and found that during the early part of the pandemic, 65% recorded their own lectures. Almost 2/3 they changed the kind of assignments or exams they gave, and nearly half said they lowered their expectations for the amount of work students would be able to do, or made it easier for students to take their course pass-fail. My question then is, how can we keep doing these things, right? Even as we maybe move out of and back into the physical classroom. It would be just a small place to start, right? But what has changed about your own teaching since the pandemic began that we could keep doing in order to increase accessibility? We've had an opportunity over the last 26 months to redesign higher education in ways we never have before. And this is how we should think about accommodations then, not as obligations, but as opportunities. Let's think about the barriers disabled students face, but also the barriers that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds face, or undocumented students face, that Black students face, or that English language learners face, or Hispanic or Latinx students face. What are those steep steps, right? How have we accommodated them? And how could we make those accommodations permanent instead of forcing those students to ask for things, right, that don't change the culture? We've had to remove retrofit our teaching in ways that remove barriers. So how will we need to change our teaching more permanently as we move forward? So those are the first two metaphors, steep steps and the retrofit. This is a kind of Three Little Pigs or a Goldilocks scenario. I'm supposed to give you like the grand solution at the end. I don't really have the grand solution, but the third metaphor of universal design, I think, gets us close, right? There's no magical solution to ableism. The truth is, faculty and students don't have positive attitudes about disability or about accommodations. Students report negative attitudes from faculty when they disclose disabilities, right? And we know that ableism is part of the fabric of our work life. The truth is, higher education presents a lot of barriers, and students are expected to navigate those barriers, and they're assessed and evaluated on their ability to do so. The institution, however, has a responsibility to ensure that arbitrary and unfair barriers are removed. We know that there are accommodations that can really help students in the classroom and in their future careers, including help with note-taking and record-keeping, technological solutions around communication and memory. We should be helping educators understand that getting assistance from any of these accommodations is not unfair. What is unfair is the way we have been doing things, devising measurements that produce unreliable results, and that measure the impacts of barriers on student learning more than they measure student learning. So universal design then is a philosophy that says, how could we build higher education from the beginning for the broadest range of possible students? As Ronald Mace wrote, universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Of course, changing physical structures, architectural approach to design, has also always been a way to challenge ideological structures. And out of this, we developed something called universal design for learning. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, and universal design for learning has three major foci, right? The first is multiple means of representation, to give learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. And I talked about the fact that during the pandemic, a lot of educators learned, for example, how to caption videos, or they learned that they could share lectures as transcripts, that they could allow students to access these things outside of the 50-minute chunks of a class, right? And that there'd be a variety of ways for them to share those materials. And that is universal design, right? The more ways that we share that information with students, the more likely they are to be able to access it, right? The second piece is multiple means of expression to provide learners with alternatives for demonstrating what they know. I talked earlier about the fact that extended time on tests and exams is the major accommodation that's being offered by Office of Disability Services. I think the other piece to understand is that those offices are really quite underfunded, right, and understaffed. In the that may not be the case at Antioch, but across the United States, the average operating budget of one of these offices is $255,000 a year, right? Most major research universities have, assistant football kicking coaches who make more money than that office makes. But they're stuck with that budget and those resources, just adjusting, moving the deck chairs around on the kind of Titanic of time tests and exams. When in reality, that's such a narrow way to provide learners with an opportunity to show what they know. And it doesn't do a good job of capturing all of the different ways that students might communicate what they know, or giving us really good information about how we've been teaching. So that's the second piece, which is, moving beyond just the traditional ways that we've given students to express what they've learned or show us what they've learned. The final piece then is multiple means of engagement to tap into learners' interests, offer appropriate challenges, and increase motivation. Most universities, when they promote the teaching that happens in their classrooms, they talk about experiential learning, entrepreneurship, hands-on learning, these kind of buzzwords that are very, very different from the idea of lecturing and testing, right? So if that's the future of education, we also need to make sure that in those multiple means of engagement, we're also developing ways for those to be accessible for all students. Okay, so that's universal design, right? The other piece for me is that universal design extends beyond this idea that on university campuses, we study disability, right? It's an object of study, to the idea that inevitably we will all become disabled at some point in our lives. So we should be planning for a world, right, in which that's the case, right? Because it will benefit all of us. But it also asks us to understand disability from a justice and a cultural perspective, rather than just a medical and a legal one. I think it asks us to foreground intersectionality. It means that we understand disablement disproportionately impacts people of color. It means we listen to disabled students. We allow them to shape their own education. And then it means the goal is not a better post-secondary education just for disabled people, but a better university for everyone. For the last decade, I've been working on creating a long list of universal design ideas. I'm going to share these now, and I'll also share a link to these ideas. But it's just, I label these as places to start, right? I think people could go and access this list, right? And there are things you could try in the classroom starting tomorrow, right? Or next week. A lot of them are cheap and easy to do. And my goal is kind of an evangelical one. I hope that people will try them and then see that they're effective and easy to do and kind of spread the word, right? So I kind of want to challenge everybody to go to that site and pick just one of these universal design ideas to try, right? But I also want to offer, just before we move on to discussion, a few quick examples, right? I think, so a few things that I think we can implement that build out of changes we've made over the last 2 years, right? But also lead us towards universal design. The first is attendance, right? I think we came to understand attendance and participation in radically new ways over the last 2 years. And I think we should never assess students' involvement based only on being in the classroom or only in 50-minute chunks again, right? More flexibility with the timing of learning might also lead to more flexibility with assessment and with deadlines. As Kathy Gleishaw has argued, quote, "We know from research on the self-determination theory that a sense of control is important for motivation. So we should consider adding some flexibility and control for students in handling deadlines in our courses. In the workplace, adults are not always subject to arbitrary hard and fast deadlines. We can work with our employers to set a pace that feels feasible and produce quality work. So why are we denying our students that opportunity?" As Dorian Therioff also argued, when universities import artificial time scarcity into classrooms, they risk replicating patterns of exclusion and discrimination And they ignore the fact that academics and other professionals' work lives are actually structured differently. So what can we do to update our policies on attendance, on deadlines, so that students learn real-time management skills and also take into account revision and reflection, for example? That's one piece. Another interesting example is that at my own Faculty of Arts at Waterloo, we were told by our Associate Dean in the spring of 2020 to assign less. This allowed me and many of my colleagues to teach more, to connect with students more, and to assess less. And I've decided myself that I'll never go back. In fact, over the years, I'd begun adding more into my courses, right? I had more to say, I'd learned more. There were more assignments and activities that I was excited about, but it got to the point where there was no space for students to revise their work, to reflect, to learn from mistakes, to sometimes start over again, right? And that kind of pattern of being able to have that space to think, to revise, to start over, is much closer to a real pattern for learning, right? Than the artificial rush that many students are in to take in as much content as they can, right? And to continually be tested. So how can we adjust content and expectations of student labor? How can we make changes to the biggest stressors systematically rather than asking students to be resilient and to adjust individually? The other piece, as you can probably imagine, is that I think we really need to take a harm reduction approach to timed tests and exams, right? Nobody walks into an engineering firm and says, put your pencils down, whatever bridge you've drawn up is the one that we're building, right? So why would we train engineers or anyone else to think under those constraints? I also think that given an increase in awareness of systemic racism, we've been able to, over the past 2 years, challenge standardized tests like the SAT, the GRE, and the LSAT. How can we extend that work, for example, with equity offices and officers to combat the discriminatory effects of all time tests and exams? Okay, so I think, if we plan for more disabled students in our classrooms, we could really change the shape of higher education. How can we work together to do that, right? I hope that in our time together today, we can talk more about how to design an alternative future for higher education. I think that we can all agree that before the pandemic, our schools had too many unnecessary barriers in place for students. And over the last couple of years, we've viewed and experienced new steep steps, new barriers, and we've seen the old ones from new perspectives. And now we have a chance to build something different.
Thank you, Dr. Dolmage. That was wonderful. I just want to remind everyone we can take questions and do some things in the chat. I've got some people helping with this, which is great. So just go ahead and pop in anything in there. And just a quick reminder that this isn't really about individualized situations, and we don't want to disclose any individuals when talking about things. It looks like our first question comes from Jesse Mann. I'm just going to skip down, everybody can see, but to the question, I'm curious why disability only enters a couple of classes when it will be such a core part of our professional lives. Talking about a lot of our programs are focused on mental health and clinical psychology.
Yeah, I think it gets at the stigma behind those disabilities. And I'm somebody who has a psychological disability, right? That you might call a psychopathology. And it's a scary word for people. And so I have to be very careful and selective about how I talk about that and with whom. That's the facts. Many of the approaches that students have, whether it's in education, they learn the labels, right? And they learn how to diagnose. And those things are very different from hearing from disabled people, right, who live with those conditions, right, or who live with those identities. And when I've done work here in Ontario to try to, for instance, get faculties of education to work with disabled people who've been through the educational system, right? There's a lot of resistance to that. And I think it has to do with that stigma, right? And that division. The truth is, one of the ways ableism works is that we're very afraid of disability. And we push it as far away as we can from our experience, right? Especially in professional contexts. That hurts everybody, right? Because the only thing that's certain is that we will all be disabled at some point in our lives. And when I say that, it sounds scary. It's okay to admit that it sounds scary because we've conditioned to hear that as a kind of scary threat. All that means is that when we experience disability, or when people we care about and love experience disability, we're not equipped to deal with it in a way that's healthy, right? In a way that's supporting, that provides care, that provides community. And a lot of the approach around, for instance, mental illness on campus is structured around risk. It constructs mental illness as risky rather than as part of life, right? Some of that has to do with, that sometimes the lack of access to counseling services, the lack of kind of flexibility within counseling services to work with students from a variety of different backgrounds. But I think Jesse's point is such a strong one. We're creating a fictional world on our campuses that doesn't look very much like, for instance, the workplace, right? Or the community outside of the university. And we will be working with people with these illnesses very regularly. But we're not building the kind of equipment, the kind of tool belt, right? Those are both reductive metaphors, but or really the kind of culture where we understand that as part of the fabric of our culture and society, or even as something that may affect us and that may be just part of our identity as we move forward. So I think a big piece of it is that from the top down, we need systems, for example, for faculty to be able to get accommodations. That's a big piece. We're losing a lot of faculty. We're losing a lot of researchers. And we can't ask or answer the big questions we face as a society if disabled people aren't part of creating those answers. So that's a piece, right? We need to take a much more proactive approach to disability and the number of students with disabilities that we're losing, because I think it's in the hundreds of thousands. And a big part of that has to do with the culture and stigma around disability on campus. So I don't have any neat and tidy answers, Jesse, but I think your argument is a really powerful and important one. And I think there are really important arguments to be made for example, a broader range of accommodations. If you think about it, what disabled students are learning on campus is that they shouldn't disclose their disability. That's a bad thing to take into a career, a tough thing to take into a career. Or when they do disclose the disability, they're learning how to accommodate their learning to testing most of the time. That's not really very good for a kind of career in which they'll have to come up with different sorts of accommodations around communication, around memory, right? Around social interaction, around stress, and instead we've kind of created this fictional world that doesn't help them learn how to be learners once they get into their careers. And that's a really big missed opportunity, I think, especially when so many universities are very focused on experiential learning, on learning that applies to a future career. My own campus, all these students go off to co-op jobs, right? But they haven't learned anything on campus to help find accommodations once they get into those jobs that are actually going to help them to succeed.
Thank you so much. Kind of some of the conversation is a little bit kind of what you touched on a little bit about barriers within higher education. And I'm seeing something else coming in, also kind of talking about saying that something that is lost in academia is the reflection and discussion with peers because of the social barriers, the stigmas you mentioned. Yeah, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mentioned it just in passing at the beginning, but it's something I think about a lot, that there's a kind of ableism demands like physical and mental, intellectual hyperability, but also like communicative hyperability and a kind of sociality that's really difficult for anyone to maintain, right? And we actually measure things like participation based on how often you put your hand up in front of a room of 500 people, right? Which is not really a very good way to measure collaboration, for example. It's not the kind of, it's not really a good measure of participation at all. If everybody put their hands up, there'd be no space for anyone to talk, right? And I know there are really valuable ways for students to support one another, to collaborate, to review one another's work, right? To provide one another feedback that doesn't require anyone to put their hand up, right? That can sometimes be done when students have time to think. I teach writing classes a lot. It's a class I love to teach. And we do a lot of peer review. And I used to do it all in the room. And all that did was create anxiety. I have so many students not show up for peer review, right? There was no reason to do it in the 50-minute period. They had no time to read the papers, no time to think or reflect. And they had no time to navigate the kind of, how do I be polite in this situation? How do I find something to praise, right? How do I not tick this person off? So all they ever said was it was good, right? But they do have really valuable things to say to one another, and they can develop really nice ways of doing it if they're just given the time and space and the medium sometimes to do it more carefully. We would never, if I submitted something to a journal, I don't want to show up to a meeting with reviewer 1 and reviewer 2. Please no, anything but that, right? But I was putting students in that circumstance over and over again. And that's just one example, right? So I think time and space for reflection, mediums where students can communicate on their own terms, where they're not being assessed based on their grammar and spelling and other things like that, and where they can develop and may have some choice in the channels they use. Some students want to speak with one another, others would rather message one another or use a message board, right? Or take the time to send comments back in a shared document, So some choice around those things, I think, is valuable. And yeah, I think, Anastasia, your question about reflection, that's the biggest thing for me. So I used to assign 4 major essays in all my classes. During the pandemic, because I was told to assign less, I went back down to 3. And what I actually found was students revised. It's what I wanted them to do all along. I give grades based on revision, but they just didn't have any time. They're just drinking from the fire hose of curriculum in all their classes. It's just always coming. And that does not provide a real opportunity for learning. So I think it was an artificial time constraint. I'm much closer in my classes now to moving down to 2 major essays than I ever am to going back to 4. It allows me to connect with students more. The other thing is, as instructors, we can't keep adding more in for ourselves, right? We need to pull back a little bit on some things like assessment so we can do some more valuable things, like have one-on-one conferences with students or join peer groups, things that I had just had no time for when I was constantly grading. So I think getting away from that, the rush of learning and building in space for reflection and revision, Anastasia, I think is such an important thing, and we need to give ourselves permission to do it. And to do it, it means letting go of some other things to do things that we value a little bit more highly. Karen, you have a question there? Hand up.
I do, but I think there's someone in queue before me. Ryan was going to read their question out loud from Andy, and then I would like to go after Andy's question.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed a little bit of time. I was trying to roll it into another question, but thanks, Karen, for going back. Yeah, I just wanted to read. So Andy wrote that you mentioned the culture in universities preventing folks from seeking accommodations. Do you have any advice for students to help change that culture or other ways to self-advocate effectively?
Sure. I mean, it's tough that's not something I really want to put on students. One piece, though, I think, is that it's important to be advocating for the presence of disability culture on campus and community. So we have Office of Disability Services. That's important. The work that they do is invaluable. We need to continue to work with them, right? But we should be helping them to get funding to do more than just accommodations, right? To have a disability cultural center, to bring in speakers and show films and create a picture and an image and a culture on campus, just like there is in the broader world, where disability is valued, right? And disability art is part of what we look at, right? And all these other things. That's so important to raise that visibility around disability and destigmatize, I think is really important. But it's tough to put that all on students, you know? That said, I think there are ways that we can, that there are arguments that we can and should be making. One of those arguments just has to do with like the issue of retention. We're just losing an unbelievable number of disabled students. And I honestly believe that there will be, that as over the next 10 years, universities will have to go one of two directions. And I believe I've sensed my own university moving in the direction of becoming tougher, more rigorous, more difficult to get into, more difficult to graduate. Which opens up a huge space, because I know there are a lot of individuals, a lot of families, a lot of potential students who are looking for something very different than that, right? And I believe that employers will begin looking for something very different than that, for a culture that doesn't value competitiveness for the sake of competitiveness, right? That values collaboration, right? Where students genuinely learn how to care for themselves and their colleagues, right? And I don't mean that in that facile way of like, you know, take care of yourself so you can continue to perform at a high level, which is the way most universities kind of package that. I really believe that there is a niche in education for the kind of institutions that value a different pace, right? That value different forms of learning, and that foreground diversity and disability really quite consciously, right? Not just as like one small group. But that's obviously not something students can change. I think that's something that we as staff and faculty and administrators, that's something that we should be pushing for. I really believe that universities are also what I call proto-public spaces. We shape the culture too. We can't just be responsive to the culture. And I believe that the culture has to change, right? The culture of the workplace is changing a lot right now, right? Drastically, radically. And so universities need to help in a way to make sure that those workplaces are places where people can have long careers, can be successful, right? Can be valued. And I think disability has a sort of central role in that kind of advocacy.
Great. I'm seeing some connections made in the chat, which is wonderful. Karen, did you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, so thank you. I think one of the things that maybe hasn't been asked yet, but as a disability support services director, and we talk about less assessment, fewer assignments, how do we encourage faculty to really take a look at their curriculum and a particular course or syllabus, and really tease out what they would call the essential requirements of that course? Because of course, we're not talking about eliminating essential requirements. What we may be talking about how to think about that a little bit differently. Do you have any words about that particular piece of it?
Yes. So, and I think it's a discipline by discipline thing, right? And another thing I should have mentioned earlier, like disability numbers are in STEM are unbelievably low. So if we already say the number of students with disabilities are low, they're so much lower in STEM. I'm not going to get the number exactly right, but it's something like only 4.5% of disabled students in total are in science, for example, physical sciences. So there are incredibly larger barriers in some disciplines than others. And so that their bigger changes are required in some ways. Not necessarily in arts and humanities, but in STEM courses. And a lot of that has to do with access to labs, but it also has to do with the kind of high regime around testing, right? Timed testing. Sorry, and I'm not really answering your question yet, Karen, but
it's okay. So just to say, at Antioch, mostly we don't do time testing. You may have faculty that quiz and test, but it's really kind of as a formative assessment tool.
Sure, like an information gathering.
It's mostly going to be papers, presentations, reflections, and faculty jump in if I'm missing some key components to how you evaluate learning. But.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. So how do you choose what to lose? I think to begin with, it takes permission to lose anything. You know, that I think that's part of the problem is we really believe that we have to do it all. And we believe that it all fits together perfectly too, that it scaffolds all together. The reality is I've done a ton of advising. Students never take the progression that we planned out so intricately. It never really works that way, right? And even the students who become like valedictorian at University of Waterloo, their educational curve looks like this, right? Up and down, bad semester off, struggling, doing really well, you know. But the myth is that it all is just straight upwards, right? Or on a straight, even keel. So I think when we see it that way, then we kind of are allowed to let go of the fantasy that like our design is perfect. Our design and everything that we teach has to be there. You know, it took for me somebody telling me I had to teach less, I had to assign less. So I guess my suggestion, Karen, would be it's experimental, just like so much else we do as educators. Can everybody try removing one major assessment for a term and see what happens, right? Or if not removing it, turn that into a purely self-graded or peer-reviewed assessment, right? Not one that you take home and you take 40 hours assessing, but one that you let students simply, you know, go through themselves and reflect on, right? And revise maybe and resubmit. It may be something that, you know, everybody ends up getting perfect on. Okay, what does that do for that term in terms of freeing up your time to, as I said, connect more? For me, it allowed me to have one-on-one conferences early in the term with all my students, and I could not have done that before. And I think the value of that is just incredibly high. It's more valuable to me, so now it's become easy. I know I'm not going to let go of that, which is something I didn't even have before. You know, so I guess my answer, Karen, is like, we need to experiment with it. Give yourself permission, or, you know, maybe in departments, you can take this on as in a group or in a pair, you know, paired teaching or peer teaching groups. What's something you could all try letting go of, and then have a discussion about what that allowed you to do a little bit more of, you know, and try it, just try it. You don't have to commit to anything, right? But just to see what happens. Because I really think that's the biggest piece. My own university talks about universal design, but universal design is architecture. It's the big stuff. It's not little adjustments. You have to be willing to change the big stuff. And I think the biggest thing to change right now is student workload.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And I want to continue that discussion. I'm just being prompted that maybe you would be willing to post your notes and slides again, because we had some people join late, and then I'll post that link to the Student Success Symposium, which will be Thursday and Friday, for those of you who might have missed all of my wonderful bombarding emails. There'll be one more opportunity for you to link into the site and just take a look to see if there's some sessions you might like to attend. And then Sarah Beth, I don't know if this is the point at which you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate all the resource sharing, and now is the time of the messy conversations where we let people go if they have class or other meetings to attend to, but we can go to a little deeper conversation for a little bit. So if you need to go, thank you for joining us. We'll hopefully see you next Monday for Dr. Mims and DPG, and then if you can hang out with us, great. We'll just start up again in a minute here. Okay, take it away.
I'm actually very interested in, I got to scroll back. There's so many good comments coming in here about self-advocacy as opportunity versus burden. Because a lot of the work of disability support services is like coming out of K-12. It's like, you really self-advocacy is great and blah, 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 but then flipping it on its head about the burden of that and negotiating access to your own learning. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that, but I just want to elevate that comment.
Yeah, it's fun. Like some universities even have really overdone that, right? You know, at University of Wisconsin system, students have a disability passport that they need to go get stamped, right? So it's very problematic. It's been written about by Neil Simpkins, but the idea is like, you need to take charge and control here, right? But the cost, like how much that would just inevitably wear students out, right? Given the stigma we know exists around disability, to have to, at the beginning of a relationship with each instructor, right? You're foregrounding disability. It'd be nice to think that instructors would be receptive to that, but the research shows that they're not actually. They can be quite dismissive of that, or sometimes even hostile, right? And so what you're actually asking students to do is very, very difficult. I mean, it is the instructor's responsibility, right? It is the institution's responsibility. And there have to be ways for students to, for example, access accommodations without, you know, that kind of parade of you know, a discrimination, right? That we might be asking them to move through. It's an interesting thing. And I think, Ariel, is such a powerful thing we need to flip, because students have to jump through a lot of hoops to even get accommodations, right? Think of how impossible it is, for example, for undocumented students to go and get the kind of diagnoses that they would need, right, to qualify for accommodations. That may not be the case at Antioch, but I know it's the case at other places, you know, and that's really difficult. And on the other hand, instructors don't have to prove anything. They don't have to justify pedagogical choices that may be discriminatory. And that should sort of be flipped, but it's not, right? Yeah, I think that it's this idea of advocacy as an opportunity, right, is a difficult one. But you know, I've already seen it, the Disability Justice Alliance group, especially if they can continue to have some input and shaping, right, that they could be a group that might be able to get meetings with a vice provost if they needed to or wanted to, right? That they could have some shaping role when there are campus concerns around, for example, issues that intersect with disability, right? Be that anti-racism, right? Be that, you know, whatever the discussion is, right? That group be given some real advocacy power, right? Not this kind of fake individual advocacy that I think can be really sort of harmful and dangerous for students on campus. We know what real advocacy looks like, and it comes through community and solidarity. So creating those opportunities, I think, is a remedy to that idea of advocacy as like your individual responsibility.
I think
I really appreciate what Andy typed, I'm sorry, Karen, into the chat. Because Andy, I just want to share that in my work, I actually hear this from students quite a bit. I'm obviously on the end where I'm helping the student get the accommodation, set it up, and our system at Antioch is we often say, you know, the student is a bit in the driver's seat. But I really appreciate what you're saying is that it's on you to use the accommodation, but that's more easier said than done because of so much of what we've talked about, the stigmatization, the culture that's there. So I really appreciate that, Andy. I understand. Yeah, I hear that pretty regularly.
I mean, another way to look at it is that every educational process is an accommodated one. We just don't talk about it that way, right? It's one of the things that being able to meet with all of my students individually at the beginning of the term is important because I can show them what accommodations I need to do my job, right? And make it clear that that's part of everybody. It really is actually a part of everybody's process, and everybody does learn differently, right? And having an open conversation about that, I think, is really important. But most of the time, we don't talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, it puts students with disabilities as the only ones who are supposed to talk about it, you know? Yeah.
And I think one of the things, you know, a lot of our colleagues around the country that we've come into contact with on the various listservs, they print off letters. They have students walking into classrooms, walking to the front of the class and handing a letter to their faculty. And at Antioch, we do it differently. That's an all digitized kind of behind the scenes process. And then students, you know, the thinking is that is not then always, you know, something that students want to share with their peers. But to the larger point of this conversation is, we have to start looking at what all that is doing, what Stigma can do. And again, this is not to fix the state of the state, but to begin, it's precisely what the messy conversation is about. How do we think about these things, and how can we think about them differently? That's not to override the Americans with Disabilities Act or any policies, but how can we begin these conversations and really start thinking about them in new ways that will, like you said, help everyone. Faculty, staff,
it's places to start, right? And I think that the issue too, like the letters, for example, it kind of facilitates this like whack-a-mole mentality among instructors. You know, there's only a disability there if it pops up as a letter in my mailbox or an email, and then I whack it with an accommodation, it goes away, and I don't have to change anything about how I teach moving forward. And if there is no letter or no email, then there's no disabled students in my classroom, and I don't have to do anything, right? And the mentality has to be, there are always disabled students in whatever room you walk into. There are always disabled people in whatever room you walk into, right? And what can you do to design the class moving forward, changing the class based on the truth of the matter, right? Which is that people need a variety of ways to access information, express themselves, engage, right? Not so that you don't have to give accommodations, but just so that you're a better teacher, right? For the diversity of students that you're going to have in the classroom. I do see that Julia, and thank you, Julia, for plugging your question there again, because I think it's a big issue. We can talk about, and we have a discussion about undergraduate education, but for graduate education, a lot of stuff gets missed, right? A lot of graduate students are employees and students at the same time, right? The relationships they have with advisors and supervisors make disclosure really difficult, right? It's difficult enough to walk in to a 250 student classroom and disclose a disability. It is incredibly difficult to walk into a 7-student classroom with an instructor who you might like to be your supervisor or hire you for an RA-ship, or you might like to work in their lab or get a summer job doing the research with them and disclose a disability, right? And so we often don't think about things very much at all for graduate students. And we need, in fact, a kind of more flexible and a much more careful system for graduate students than we do. We need more education for people who are teaching graduate classes, for grad chairs, right? To understand that, no, you know, in my own department, a lot of the attitude was, well, of course, everybody is going to do the best that they can. We're all going to do the best we can, right? Which is not the debate, right? The problem was people were doing the best that they could, but they were violating people's privacy, right? They were talking about the idea that accommodations came out of a department speaker's budget or whatever, right? So I think one of the biggest pieces for graduate education is centralized accommodations for graduate students, just the same as we have centralized accommodations for undergraduate students. So those accommodations don't come out of individual budgets, and so that those students can go and speak to people who will protect their privacy. And of course, then we also need those policies for faculty, because the same thing happens to faculty. You might feel compelled to disclose a disability to your chair or to your dean, and you shouldn't have to. Those are also your colleagues, right? Those are people who can make huge decisions about your career. And they could be biased against you. And that's one of the reasons why graduate students don't disclose disability and why faculty don't disclose disability. So, you know, I think we've developed a pretty robust system that at least protects the rights of undergraduate students. We have to develop a system that protects the rights of grad students, staff, and faculty as well.
So our grad students are under the same policy and procedures that our undergraduates are. Here at Antioch, I just feel compelled to say that out loud.
Yeah, but again, you know what? It's worth opening up and having that discussion too, because sometimes in particular graduate programs, there can be things that you don't see, right? Ways that there could be more education among faculty to, for instance, never talk about a student's disability status. You know, it's just smaller groups, right? More informal conversations and interactions, right? People might be going to conferences together. They might be spending more social time together. There's just more to navigate in graduate education sometimes. More nuance there, but also more opportunity for discrimination, unfortunately.
Dr. Dolmage.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
An anonymous question to pose, but if you want to go on with another one, Ryan, we can take it after.
I was actually going to fuse yours with someone else, so just go ahead, Sarah Beth. Thank you.
I had someone send me a private message. They're saying, I'm a student with chronic mental health struggles. I've had encounters with professors who, out of understandable frustration about my performance, voiced doubt about my ability to do well once I moved on to other programs. I failed and struggled and stumbled to advocate and communicate my needs, but I'm struggling to shake the shame. Do you have any insight or advice for students who aren't, quote, high functioning or, quote, reliable in a conventional sense?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's a great question. I think the truth is, I mean, I've been teaching for a long time, I guess. I've done a fair amount of advising. The one thing I would say is students, staff, faculty, all of us, the culture does a really good job of making it seem like we're all okay all the time. Faculty, you know, it's incredibly annoying, but faculty do a really good job of bragging, for example, you know, of making it seem like success is all that we experience. You know, a lot of the culture is based on that, you know, sharing success, not sharing the failures that come along the way. The truth is, behind all of that, there is a lot of struggle, right? There is a lot of difficulty. My hope is that the pandemic opened people up more to understand the context from which most of us are living and learning and working is a pretty messy one, not a perfect one, not an easy one. That said, it's not easy to admit that or to say, like, you be the one who admits that when everyone around you seems to be incredibly successful, right? And having an easy time of it, because that's the culture, that's what we're supposed to show. It doesn't help that universities are asking for that kind of level of resilience, right? They don't ask people to be realistic, they ask them to be resilient, right? And resilience says, don't stop, don't give up, keep going, right? No matter what. Also, I think there's ableism in higher education functions and is perpetuated by the fact that if we really want to dismantle it, we have to say that the system that rewarded us is also a broken system. That's really hard for people to do. It's really, really difficult to say, and I'll say it as a white male, right? Who grew up in an era when education was incredibly affordable as a middle-class person, right? I had every advantage. And so that's a big part of why I am a professor. But we don't want to admit that, right? It's difficult to admit that, even though we have to admit that the system needs to be changed, right? Because it also means admitting that maybe we don't deserve the privilege we've been given, right? Or we're not as highly successful as we've tried to project ourselves as being. So it's not really much of an answer, but I think what I need to say is it's very complicated and very hard. And it's psychological, it's ego work. It's not just like structural work and change. It's ego work. And that's very hard for people to do. But I think that I'm hoping that we're moving closer to those kinds of conversations with one another, right? Creating an opportunity for like messy conversations is a big deal. It's not a small thing. I don't think my campus would be comfortable doing that. So it's some credit to you that you've done it and you're going to keep doing it, right? Those are the kind of spaces that you have to create. And I think it sets a good model for students that, yes, it is pretty messy. It's not neat and tidy all the time. And it's difficult. Yeah.
Dr. Dolmage, something that was kind of brought up in a few questions is kind of this gatekeeping role. Sarah Beth mentioned it, and then also someone else mentioned it in terms of, I can't remember the subclinical, things that are maybe a little smaller, subclinical conditions, and having to, the feeling that students then have to kind of prove their disability. Sarah Beth was speaking a little bit more to the field of psychology, and that there's still this gatekeeping function a little bit among clinicians, and that.
Yeah, I think that there's gatekeeping in particular fields as well. In part, they're kind of paradigmatic, that when a lot of the orientation in a given field is around curing or eradicating disability, there may not be a lot of space for claiming disability as a culture or an identity. That said, I know that like at the highest levels, those conversations are happening, right? Whether that's in the APA, for example, or larger conversations among med school administrators, in part because we need psychologists and doctors who look like the rest of our community, right? We need to reflect the diversity of our citizens in all of our professions. And part of that is kind of coming to understand disability as a group that's being excluded to begin with, right? Looking at the numbers, looking at the retention rates, at the success rates, and the gatekeeping that is happening and has been very successful in those fields, and saying that we're committed to change. We had a big lever in Ontario was universities had to count the number of disabled students, and they had to count them in particular disciplines. And they don't have to do that anymore. And because they don't have to do it anymore, it's going to be really hard to advocate for things to change. When we could show that there are actually fewer disabled students year upon year, that's what was happening, right? And I should say, like, the media, the common perception makes it seem like there are more disabilities and they're stranger than ever before. And there's more people asking for more things related to disability than ever before. And it's just the opposite is true. That's not what's happening. In fact, we have like I said, from the National College Health Assessment, we have a generation of students right now who are going to experience more disability than the generation before, and they're going to ask for less help. And so the changes need to be large, right?
There's another question here from a student. Any advice for students who've been told by a teacher that their requested accommodation is not reasonable, such as one teacher saying yes and another saying it's not a reasonable accommodation? To bring it to a more systemic level, any advice for educational institutions for how to train or frame for faculty on what accommodations can or should look like?
Yeah, I think that they're in general, and I keep saying things, you all are like several steps ahead. Okay, I just want to say that from my own institution, from most of the institutions that I'm at. But if I can generalize, knowing that it may be different where you are, in general, across North America, there's almost no training for teachers, period. A lot of the most successful researchers do no teaching because they're such great researchers. And they graduate from their PhDs and they've had no training in teaching. And they are told, in fact, for the first 4 or 5 years of their career, that they really better not care about teaching too much, or they won't achieve tenure, right? We have another group of, over 50%, getting closer to over 60% of instructors on campuses are contingent faculty, not on the tenure track, not under any of those pressures, but also not able to point out and advocate for change because they're constantly reapplying for work, right? And so that's another problem. That group can have a really hard time pushing back against some of the larger ableist structures because they're simply hoping to get rehired again because they're cobbling together teaching contracts, right? So that's a pretty tough problem. That's a pretty good formula for teaching in a lot of the same ways that we did in like the 90s, and for a very conservative culture where one group doesn't have the power to change very much and the other group is told not to care. That's a pretty bleak picture, I'm sorry, but I'm just being honest. So any training that there can be is a plus. And it shouldn't just be for the coalition of the willing. And I know at your campus, I bet you there's a group, and they're the group who come to the messy conversations, and they're the group who probably go to the Center for Teaching Excellence workshops, and they're doing an unbelievable job. And they are leading cultural change, but I bet you there's a whole group of people that you wish would come, So big things that I've seen are, putting the resources into it, having entire days where there's no classes so that instructors can do that work and be paid for it, compensated for it. A lot of community colleges do retreats where it's just teaching training for an entire day or 2 days, and people are paid to be there, and there are no classes on those days, no conflicts at all. I wish universities, especially larger universities, would do that. It would signal that they care about teaching a lot more than they seem to, And so smaller, more nimble institutions should do that. And that's a way to increase their advantage, right? By caring more about teaching, caring more about students. And then I guess the final piece of that would be like involve disabled students in delivering that training. They are experts on learning, and the degree to which they can provide input and feedback about what they want teachers to know is really valuable.
I
commenting to institutional muscle a little bit there, institutional muscle and institutional support, which is really important.
Yeah.
Shelley, you made a comment, add disability into DEI initiatives and training for staff and faculty. Do you want to say more?
Oh, hi, everybody. I'm really passionate about this because I have a disability myself. I have a physical disability. So you can't tell by the way I'm sitting, but this is like the work that I do. I work at the University of Miami and I'm in the doctoral program here in leadership and change. So that's how I got invited to this. But I have noticed where I am at the University of Miami that disability is not included into DEI initiatives. It's race, ethnicity, gender, gay, lesbian, which is all important. We're not saying it's not, but add disability into that as well. Kind of what you're saying, Jay, that it's a culture and it's a important topic, and have people with disabilities do some of the training. And I actually do that with one of my colleagues who has an invisible disability. He's on the autism spectrum. So he and I teach medical students and undergraduate students and psychology students. So we're kind of busy, but I just think that's really important.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think like sometimes that gets framed the wrong way as like, we get racism and we get sexism. We don't understand ableism. No, we don't. We do not get racism. We have not figured out sexism, right? But ableism intersects with these things, right? And ableism is used in service of racism and sexism, right? And the discriminatory impacts cut across these groups, and I think so then I think there's alliance building, community work to do, right? And like you said, when disabled people are acknowledged as the experts, they're going to be busy like you are, but that is a good problem to start with, right? Compensate students for their expertise, compensate staff and faculty for their expertise, and, you know, try to spread the word.
I think a theme that is coming clear in the last few comments really is, you know, this is the same issue as the anti-racism work that we're talking about and focusing is there's no monolith experience of disability, that we really have to listen and we have to hear what people are going through and understand their experiences and their needs from a relational perspective. And I appreciate so much all of the resources and experience and beautiful analogies that you gave us today, Jay, and trying to really grapple and understand the complexity of these intersectionality issues for our work together. And I thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, it looks like there's some more hands still.
Couple hands. Yeah.
Yeah. I swing one. Did you want to?
Someone. Hi.
Someone.
I'm currently in the in the Masters of Psychology program, and we do talk about ableism in our program. And a big thing that you mentioned was visibility around disability. And it's something that, you know, as an able-bodied person, I didn't really, you know, take a look at my own biases. So in terms of looking at visibility around disability, do you have any suggestions as to how to kind of see the things that I thought were invisible, like any media or books or authors that you might recommend that might be helpful? Thank you also for this talk.
Sure. Yeah, this will sound like too obvious an answer, but there's an incredible book called The Disability Visibility Project. And that's the first place I would suggest. And I think there may be even as an open access version of that. Yeah, some great examples here, Shelley. Crip Camp is like an unbelievable documentary movie that shows some of the intersectional basis of the disability rights movement in North America. Great kind of primer on where a lot of this has come from, right? And that it's been around for a long time. But I think those two resources, those would be the places I think I would start. And like, you know, as a grad student, see if there's ways for you to build this into your own teaching, right? Into your own programs, you know, try to get those conversations together between the folks in psychology who do teach ableism and maybe some other people in English who do that, right? Or in anthropology. And then you can start building, you know, what would it look like to have a minor where students could put courses together, right? Or a certificate that really values that as a field that they could build knowledge in, right? Not just as a place to like check a box, right? But to build a research program around or a career.
We have a lot of other resources popping into the chat on Reed, so that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. We also have another, we have hand up Jesse Z.
Hello, thank you so much for taking my question. I just wanted to say real quickly, if I could, to the person who wrote in about feeling shame about asking for accommodations, and because that touched my heart so much, because I feel it so much. I'm a person who's been disabled with bipolar disorder and PTSD for a decade, and I'm in the middle of my therapy training, and the only reason I was able to do that is because of my own mental health advocacy and activism work, that I could find therapists who are already working, who are successful, who had similar stories to mine. And I want everybody to know that there is a wave coming. We're in it, but we're on the cusp of it, where people are going to be out about their diagnoses. A lot of therapists have diagnoses. It's not like we're just the only ones that are like starting. There are generations of people who are mental health professionals dealing with really impactful mental health challenges. And there is a wave, there is a movement. We're just at the very cusp of it. And I think the shame that we're feeling is because we are kind of kicking this door down. So to that person who wrote in, my email is jman5@antioch.edu. Please reach out to me. Let's talk. I've got your back. I've been so lucky to find other people who are on this track with me, who are open, who are out, who are supporting each other. And we're going to do this together. And we're not just going to do it together for our own little group. We're part of a wave that is coming. And we got to do it for the people who are behind us too. So, and I think in that togetherness, that shame, it doesn't sting quite so bad. So let's get together. Let's keep it up. Please hang in there if you can. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the lecture. And thank you for the advocacy.
Thank you, Jesse.
Anybody else have anyone else, anything to share? Yeah.
I would just like to say, I hope this is the beginning of many other messy or otherwise conversations that we're able to have about some of the concepts that we've started talking about today. I would like to reiterate something that Mary Granger put in the chat, which is if that you are struggling or you haven't yet reached out to request accommodations, or you have and you're finding it not as helpful as you thought it might be, to please reach out to your DSS coordinator on your campus. And if for whatever reason that does not feel possible to you at this time, I'm always available at kchrist@antioch.edu to hear you and help you problem solve.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Jay, for being here. Jay, thank you for all of the wisdom that you imparted to us and for the opportunity to have a messy conversation on this topic. And as Karen just said, to future conversations and to more engagement and action that we can all engage in to make it a more supportive place for all of us.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to get to meet all of you. And I put my email in the chat there. Please do reach out if there are any other questions or anything that I can help with. You know, I wish I could be there in person, but it's also just so nice to be able to be there so easily and see you all. And please do, you know, reach out if there's any way I can help any further. And good luck, everyone. Yeah, Jesse's comments were such a powerful and motivating way to end the conversation too, I think. So I'm going to hold on to that, and it's going to give me energy. You know, it's just Monday evening, so there's lots of work in front of us.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.